Good. Well, thank you for that, Joan. It's a delight to see you again, and I'm grateful to The Economist for the opportunity to speak today. It's especially a privilege to be able to hear the remarks just now from Prime Minister Ciucă, and let me extend my greetings to him and other Romanian friends in the audience today. Romania is a place that's very dear to my heart. I've spent a lot of time in Romania over the years and have a lot of colleagues and acquaintances there. And I know there's a lot of anxiety in Romania and neighboring frontline NATO states because of what's happening next door following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think we've all been shocked, frankly, by the savagery that Putin has displayed in this conflict. We all see the pictures coming out of Ukraine. And on a human level, I think we have to start by acknowledging the tragedy of what's occurring there. We see the devastated cities, the children that are being pulled out of the rubble. And all of this has been a sobering reminder that, well, the old-fashioned word for it is evil, that evil is alive and well in the 21st century. Here in the United States, the war, as you probably know, has galvanized our public attention. It's reshuffling our politics. But of course, we don't feel the effects of the conflict the way that you do there in Romania. The members of your audience who are sitting next to the conflict right there at the frontier, you there in the region see the refugees arriving, you feel the impact on regional trade, and you almost certainly feel more intensely than anyone the danger that the war could escalate or spread. The organizers asked me to say a few words about what businesses and governments there in the Black Sea region can expect over the next few months, how long the war is likely to last, whether it'll end anytime soon, and what the aftermath will be for regional economies, energy security, the European Union, NATO, et cetera. So let me address each of those questions in turn. First of all, I think at this point, we have to plan on the expectation that this will not be a short conflict. I think we have to assume that it will last several more months, possibly through the end of the year, and that even if a political resolution is reached, that the conditions will now exist for a simmering, maybe intermittent conflict in the years ahead. I think Putin wanted a short, decisive war in which he would quickly change the government in Ukraine to a pro-Kremlin direction. Obviously, he got a very different outcome. I think the sacrifice and the resilience of the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian people is one of the great events of our time. The longer the war goes on, I think the greater the chance that Putin will be deposed, either by his own people or by the Praetorians in the Kremlin. The Russian army has, of course, lost thousands of soldiers and a lot of equipment, probably the flower of its elite units, probably a good portion of its most advanced munitions. So it's certainly possible that those losses will force Putin to accept a negotiated settlement. But I don't think that is going to happen soon for a couple of reasons. One, I think both Russia and Ukraine possess ample resources to continue the conflict. The Russians have suffered a lot of losses, but still have a material advantage and probably a bottomless supply of artillery shells, for example, to keep pounding Ukrainian cities. The Ukrainians have a very large and motivated force in the field at this point that is well supplied with Western weapons. But I also think that both Putin and Zelensky, for very different reasons, have a lot of motivation to keep fighting. Putin's motivation is the continued existence of his regime and his own life. I think Zelensky's motivation is to defend and reclaim the Ukrainian homeland. If Putin were to accept a negotiated settlement without a very large amount of territory, it could cost him his regime. And I think if Zelensky were to concede territory at this stage, it would probably cost him the support of the Ukrainian people. So even if there were the terms for a settlement coming into view tomorrow, it would probably only be a pause that Russia would use to rearm and continue the conflict at a later date. even in the worst case that Putin uses chemical weapons or, God forbid, nuclear weapons, it's very unlikely at this point that he would break the will of the Ukrainian people to resist. And I think the war is creating generational enmities that will be with us for a very long time. So for all of those reasons, I expect the war in its current or a similar form to be protracted. My second assumption is that as the war continues, the center of gravity will shift more and more to the south of Ukraine, to the Black Sea coast. I think Putin has largely relinquished his initial objectives and is focusing more and more on the coastline, the east and south of the country, for both economic and strategic reasons. I think if he can control all or most of the Ukrainian coastline, he can deprive Ukraine of a viable economy after the war. Ukrainian ports will probably remain offline for many months, maybe longer. Even if the Ukrainians hold Odessa, which it looks like they will, it will probably be unusable as a port for a very long time because the Russians control the approaches to that port, both from Snake Island at the mouth of the Danube and Sebastopol. So I would expect to see Ukrainian wheat and other exports remain disrupted. Russia will probably continue its policy of hoarding its own grain supply well into the summer. And of course, Russian energy exports are now highly constricted. The last figures that I saw, Russian crude by vessel had dropped from about 2 million barrels a day to around zero or next to zero. And of course, the economic effects of all of this are very well known to the people in the room there. I expect we will see sustained inflationary pressures, shortages, supply chain disruptions, all of that well into the future. I think factories in the region will continue to face challenges with parts that are sourced from Ukraine or Russia for obvious reasons. Probably more and more of a ripple effect on German and other Western manufacturing in the region. And then, of course, in certain cases, and I'm thinking of Turkey in particular, there's a high degree of vulnerability, and we could even see a currency crisis for the lira. Romania is a resilient country with strong institutions and a well-established ecosystem of private industry, and I have no doubt that it will continue to thrive for all the reasons outlined by the Prime Minister. But I think we have to be honest about the challenges that lie ahead. The other thing I would say is that none of this is localizable. The longer the war goes on, the more likely we are to see stagflation at the global level. So far, we've seen a very high degree of solidarity between the United States and European Union on sanctions, and in Europe's case, a willingness to increase defense spending. And I hear it frequently asked whether this impulse of solidarity will prove durable. High gas prices always boomerang in politics, and it's also possible that European publics could grow somewhat reticent about defense spending when they see reductions in social spending. But I actually think that the new solidarity will be durable because it's rooted in a very powerful motivator, which is fear. I think there's a palpable fear that Putin will keep going. If you look at polling data in Germany, something like 30% of Germans a year ago would have said that they thought NATO was necessary for their country's security. Now that number is closer to 75 or 80%, which is remarkable. I don't see that dissipating quickly. I also think the war is setting in motion changes that will have a momentum all of their own. You have several Western oil companies that have pulled out of Russia. That's not something that will quickly be undone, and it will inevitably affect long-term Russian output. The German government is developing plans for LNG terminals. You'll see long-term contracts developing on the basis of European countries willing to pay a premium to mitigate supply vulnerabilities. And my point is that all of that, once it's set in motion, is likely to have a momentum and a kind of continuity to it. In the case of the United States, I also think the war's effects will not be transitory. I think we will see the administration and Congress, well, today we see a very high level of consensus in U.S. policy. I think we'll keep up the pressure on sanctions. We'll keep sending military aid to Ukraine. And I think we'll see a new consensus form. I think it's forming now, and in the next few weeks you'll see it more, of a willingness to build permanent U.S. military bases in Eastern Europe, perhaps including the permanent relocation of the Stryker Brigade that was recently deployed on a temporary basis from Germany to Romania. Where you do see a debate in the United States is over whether we should get directly involved in the conflict in some way. There's a push in some circles to impose a no-fly zone. For reasons I'm happy to elaborate on, I don't think that will gain momentum. There's also a push to say that our objective is regime change in Russia, which President Biden seemed to allude to last week, but I don't see any indication that that is or will be official policy. I think the bigger question for the United States is how much resources we should siphon towards Europe, knowing that China could very well use this moment to make a move on Taiwan. And of course, the United States military is currently not configured to handle major war with Russia and China simultaneously. But what I think Putin has done is given us an unexpected opportunity in the West to focus first and foremost on the challenge of Russia. I think Putin probably moved on Ukraine on a faster timeline than Xi would probably like to move on Taiwan. And so the longer Putin is bogged down in Ukraine, the more I think he will face a situation like the Soviets faced in Afghanistan, where his military is being bled white and his economy is being wrecked at home. Finally, if I had to say where all of this ends, I think it's probably a military stalemate that eventually allows for a negotiated settlement in which Ukraine takes on a special status. It may be what you could call fortified neutrality, so something on the model of Finland today, where perhaps Ukraine decides to relinquish the objective of NATO membership, but eventual EU membership may stay in the equation. But the only way that this will work is for the West to have a long-term strategic and economic commitment to Ukraine, to arm the Ukrainians to the teeth, to help rebuild their economy, maybe by using seized Russian assets or foreign exchange reserves as a form of reparations. I think that's where we will eventually end in some form or fashion. Unfortunately, I think it'll probably cost a lot more lives before we reach that point, just given the situation on the battlefield. But to end on a positive note, I think if there is a silver lining to the war, the awful situation in Ukraine, I think it is that Putin has managed in the course of a few weeks to bring about a remarkable degree of unity and resolve in the Western world, a greater degree of unity than we've seen in generations. And I think the war has reminded us what we're fighting for, what we have in common, what's worth preserving. Putin is clearly overplaying his hand, and the sacrifices of the Ukrainians, I think, are giving the West an opportunity to get our own affairs in order, and it's up to us to make the most of that opportunity. So I'll stop on that relatively positive note, and I want to say again how grateful I am to have the opportunity to join the discussion, and I look forward to hearing any questions.